Of their wisdom let Herodotus speak, and Dio, who calls them the wisest of mankind. Of their courage let their enemies tell, and we, their sons, who are here enjoying the countries which their swords won from the Romans, their civilized brethren, who had conquered all nations, yet yielded to them. Of their learning, when by circumstances they advanced in society in different countries, let the Greeks, their eldest progeny who enjoyed their circumstances, declare. The Romans next, and the modern Europeans, the last but not the least of their sons." End quote. In this video, I hope to help prove what will strike many conventionally minded scholars as a bold claim, namely that the sprawling and powerful Gothic people family, who lie at or near the root of virtually all Western peoples and cultures, and represent Europe's royal line and most foundational building block, very likely stem directly from the, quote, genuine Scythian element, who in turn lies still closer to that root, and that these two groups were perhaps even essentially one and the same, as innumerable older histories clearly attest. It's important to make clear that I so consistently return to the ancient Scythian and this people family, not simply because they're a single branch of particular personal interest, but rather because I believe they best represent the core of that tree that produced countless branches of interest. I'd suggest they're also the best example of a particular culture of nobility and virtue, courage and principle, which we see represented throughout all of Europe's best and brightest eras and high points, especially in the knightly and chivalric orders, and a worldview and mindset and approach which was a hallmark of Western peoples, and often the most stark point of contrast with those who lay outside their sphere. I recently discovered Cassiodorus' collection of the letters and proclamations dictated to him by Theodoric the Great, and continually find myself coming back to them because they're so uniquely impressive. Quote, "Hear Theodoric, the Gothic king himself, dictating to his secretary Cassiodorus, and you hear the voice of such kings as render themselves gods to mankind. Favor justice, employ courage in the defense of innocence, that amid the crimes of other nations you may show the justice of the Goths. And do you imitate our Goths, whose courage in battle can only be equaled by their domestic modesty. And elsewhere, let the wars of other kings be crowned with the spoils and ruin of captured cities. It is our purpose, with the help of God, to conquer, that our subjects shall only grieve that they acquired our protection too late. And finally, this is the praise of the Goths, to preserve inviolate the natural laws of humanity." End quote. When we think of empires, we often think of strict, perhaps even tyrannical and brutal rule, perhaps the harsh enslavement of all conquered peoples, or an enforcement of the adoption of a culture and language of the conquering element. Our modern understanding of Rome, especially a late and increasingly degenerate Rome, has helped shape the bulk of our understanding here. A Rome that gradually, especially toward her end, created a multiracial and multicultural stew of peoples in an ultimately failed attempt to increase her own power and reach and profitability. I'd suggest this is one of the foremost reasons we've had trouble recognizing the empire we're about to speak to as an empire. It's a big statement, but one I'm now confident in making. I'd suggest this hidden empire, this relatively subtle or loose-knit confederation of peoples, magnanimously governed and ruled by an aristocratic minority, may well be the most important and relevant empire in recorded history, with regard to its effects on the development of the history of Western mankind up until this very day, and certainly the most important, quote, empire that a great many of us have likely never heard of. It didn't just intertwine with Rome as she degraded and degenerated into oblivion in her final years, but its peoples anciently shared an immense overlap with most of the figures who helped build Rome in the first place. I'd suggest the same might be said of Greece, of Persia, of much of the Levant and Mesopotamia across long stretches of time, even of northwestern India, even, incredibly, China, Japan, and the Koreas, and the ruling and royal lineages of each. In this video, I'd like to state openly many of the things I've only hinted at in prior installments, both because I'm now confident enough in the conclusions, and because I think it's increasingly important that we do begin to state such things, clearly and openly. When we lose an understanding of our history and a clear vision as to where we come from and the generational journey we've taken, we lose so much more than it might seem at first glance. And in a very real sense, we lose a piece of ourselves. I believe this history lies closest to the root of all Western peoples and cultures, and crucially, I've seen a great deal of evidence, whether conspiratorially driven or organic, it's difficult to say with 100% certainty, that this history is being aggressively minimized, ignored, mischaracterized, and in many circles, outright lied about. I certainly don't think all of those individuals involved in this process are conscious deceivers, but I do sense a mysterious hidden hand helping push much of it along, and using immense money and power and influence to obfuscate and mislead, to essentially rewrite the record. In short, I'd suggest that World War II radically changed our cultural and scholarly trajectory in so many ways, and made simple and all-important terms like Aryan, that were once routinely used, practically verboten overnight, and made any comprehensive discussion of peoples like the Goths and their history and achievements virtually impossible in the environment of post-World War II academia. When I later came to realize the National Socialist Germans had shown great interest in the history of the Goths, this contrast began to make far more sense. But I think this studious ignorance has been disastrous in its net effects. I'm of the belief that history, if not relayed as truthfully and accurately as is possible, no matter where that truth might lie, isn't just harmed in the process, but becomes actively harmful. Recasting history itself to suit any political or ideological agenda seems such a supremely devastating and disorienting misstep. As mentioned before, some misled academics may actually believe they have positive or justified reasons for tossing dirt atop these findings and pointing in every other possible direction when it comes to speaking to our collective European heritage. In an age that's made equality and egalitarianism into a golden idol placed on a pedestal, one that now seemingly refuses to admit even the potential for innate differences in groups of mankind, past or present. The notion of an exceptionally successful and highly gifted subset of mankind, spreading and loosely ruling far and wide, would be a notion that such scholars would naturally aim to avoid, even destroy to the best of their ability. And frankly, I'm tired of hearing what I believe to be highly politicized history, if one can even call it history anymore, that aims to create a picture of what many muddied modern minds might wish to be true, as opposed to what seems to have so obviously actually transpired, if we are to take the bulk of our earliest histories and those pinned up until the World Wars as our foremost guides. There's such an incredible story still to be told here, and it's equally incredible just how little of it has yet been told, and how much of it seems to have been confined to the shelves of dusty back rooms, or even, I fear, lost forever, because, quote, misplaced, or lost in various disasters or destructions of libraries across the ages, or perhaps even sitting behind lock and key in a Vatican library somewhere, robbing us all of invaluable context. Much of the content of this video was going to be very different. Yet, similar to what occurred as I was creating the previous Subverted History video, I've recently come across an engaging book that caused me to drop virtually everything else and instead focus on its contents entirely. A work entitled An Inquiry into the History of Scotland by one John Pinkerton. Just a few quick notes on Mr. Pinkerton before we begin in earnest. He seems to have been a bit of a polymath and a multifaceted and multidisciplinary thinker and scholar. From his youth, he was apparently drawn to and became immersed in the classics, and it's said that even in his earliest childhood years, he enjoyed translating Roman authors such as Livy. He was a Scottish antiquarian, cartographer, author, numismatist, historian, and to this day, his maps are acknowledged as some of the greatest of their day and beyond. And a great many historians drew from his work, notably even Edward Gibbon, who of course gave us the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and who even acknowledged his indebtedness to the specific work of Pinkerton we'll be most heavily citing here on the Goth and Scythian. Pinkerton has been called eccentric by some, and this seems fair enough, and he was perhaps energetic and opinionated to the point of being a difficult man to deal with at times, especially for those he thought were engaging in history writing in a slapdash and misleading way. The environment in which he authored his works should also be noted, because relevant. Many leading Scottish and Irish thinkers of the day were attempting to fully understand their roots, and there was a raging debate as to the definition of terms like Celtic or Germanic, and the degree to which the populations of both of these peoples and their neighbors represented either label. Pinkerton himself can occasionally speak harshly about the Celtic peoples, but it's crucial to understand that his particular usage of Celtic is exclusively and narrowly defined as those groups of people who traveled the least and who were most lorded over in a seemingly corrupt and tyrannical sense by what seems to be a corrupted Druidic class that had most lost its way, the worst examples of the Druidic class, almost Talmudic in nature and word and deed, whose aims seem to exclusively be personal power and control and material dominance, and who seem to see these populations as more akin to cattle than free and capable men. It's important to note how difficult it is to separate the Germanic and Celtic elements, because these were so often lumped together and used as synonyms, that the spectrum of the one to the other has no definitive dividing line. Many of the peoples we call Celtic to this day were very obviously direct and fairly recent outgrowths of the Germanic people group, ethnically, racially, genetically, and some of those we call Germanic have extremely strong Celtic influence, both ethnically and culturally. Both of these groups so obviously spring from a single root. To my mind, it's only a question of when that divergence occurred. But they certainly went on to develop slightly different character and culture and history. And a large group of, quote, Celtic peoples, specifically those who made up the small pockets of, quote, indigenous populations in the furthest west of Europe, likely split from those peoples we consider most archetypically Germanic at a very early date, perhaps as early as 1500 BC or before, but certainly by 500 BC, only to begin blending together once again in relatively modern times within modern Europe. So if Pinkerton does display a bias, it's here. He seems to want to communicate that the bulk of Scotland's roots lie with the Germanic peoples with a history of far-flung travel and achievement, as opposed to the most, quote, indigenous Celtic elements, with a far more isolated and simple recorded history. And he almost seemed in a bit of an active war in his day, with a specific writer or two that were attempting to emphasize the purely Celtic elements of Scotland's lineage, and was obviously angered and frustrated at what he seems to see as lazy and shoddy history on the part of some of these thinkers. One final note to reiterate the importance of this subject matter. This large family of peoples, appropriately called Germanic, if we take germinate to be a root of this etymology, and that they seemed to be a seed people from which a vast number of branches would spring over the past 4,000 years and what little recorded history we still have, absolutely should not be thought of as confined to Germany, or even exclusively Northwestern Europe, or even exclusively Europe. The, quote, Germanic peoples today simply represent a single, largely unmixed element of this larger family, much as Tacitus so clearly mentioned in his histories. If Pinkerton is correct, and if my own theories are correct, this group has a much more wide-ranging and almost all-pervasive history, due to covering an immense amount of land and sea, and seemingly having an ongoing cultural policy of regularly sending a significant portion of its young men whenever conditions started to become a bit overcrowded, or whenever great adventure was sought, into foreign territories and new shores, as pioneers, settlers, or even conquerors. Though it must be restated, this was absolutely not a group that sought to enslave and rule foreign populations in any heavy-handed or brutal way. Far from it. In fact, they seemed to want to maintain an arm's-length degree of separation. Their style of rule, or loose government or political structure, seems much more akin to the feudalism of early Europe, which of course makes perfect sense, as these traditions of Europe spring directly from this same people and culture, and to some degree represent practices that extend as far back as our recorded history. Think of a martial elite, similar to chivalric knighthood orders, who almost always left conquered or vassal or allied peoples to manage and till their own land, and merely asked for periodic tribute in exchange, and, in trade, offered protection from outside threats or roving bands of criminals who might otherwise seek to raid and make off with cattle or slaves, or even conquer outright if the opportunity presented. It's my belief that the less restrictive and invasive nature of this, quote, rule has caused this incredibly unique and powerful empire to be so overlooked by so many, so profoundly, especially modern scholars, who seem almost incapable of wrapping their head around the fact that Rome and Greece, as legitimately impressive as they were in so many ways, weren't the unilateral and exclusive epicenters of all human existence, but rather that almost all surviving accounts happened to emanate from their hands and their specific perspectives. And that even here, if one reads enough and reads closely, the ancient connections are innumerable. Ancient Greece, especially, speaks a great deal of the population to their north, and features them heavily in both their artwork and their stories of their origins, their heroes and myths, etc. Those academics that attempt to paint a firm dividing line between the Scythian and Goth and Hellenic Greek, for example, are doing something of an immense disservice. Yes, there were many cultural differences that developed over time, but these peoples can only truly be understood when we recognize their shared history, heritage, and ancestry. Just as the Scythians are spoken of as either the same or very closely related to and proximate neighbors of the Hyperboreans, the ancient Greeks might be considered to have a somewhat similar relationship with their earliest Scythian neighbors. In the previous work, I highlighted Christopher Beckwith's The Scythian Empire. The Scythians were not only massive in number, but covered truly vast distances, and in Beckwith's view, and my own, essentially ruled or governed or loosely organized populations within those distances in something of an empire. As the Scythians disappear from history, magically and with little to no explanation according to modern scholarship, the Goths equally suddenly appear in the same location known to be inhabited by royal Scythians, and suddenly take the stage of world history. Apparently, if we're to believe the conventional modern academic theories, they'd been quietly hibernating until this moment. It's my view that none of this was magic, and that the Gothic people, who became the foundational bedrock upon which so much of Europe has been built, and the obvious root of her royal lines and lineages, are something of a continuation of this Scythian element, and seemed to be, to speak it frankly, the most formidable force on the world stage. To quote Pinkerton, the Scythians or Goths who slew Cyrus, whom Alexander shunned, and who were the terror of Pyrrhus, were, in their German seeds, equally formidable. Not the Samnians, not the Carthaginians, not the mingled nations of Spain and of Gaul, nor even the Parthians themselves were so dangerous to Roman power. Carbo and Cassius, Scarus Aurelius and Servilius Scipio and Marcus Manlius, with their 5 consular armies, were all taken prisoner or slain by the Teutones and Cimbri, who had fled from the northern Germans. Julius declined the contest with the Germans. Augustus wept the fate of Varus and his legions. Hardly could Drusus and Nero and Germanicus defend this frontier of the empire, for this was the whole ambition of Rome. In later times, they were triumphed over, but not conquered. Under their ancient name of Scythi or Goths, they were soon, by degrees, to seize on the whole Western Empire, nay, to pour over the fertile coasts of Africa. The Vandali, whom Tacitus and Pliny found in the north of Germany, were to fight with Belisarius in the plains of Numidia. The Suevi were to possess the fragrant fields of Spain. The Langobardi were to enjoy the orange groves of Italy. The Angli, whom Tacitus puts in a list of names, were to give their name to a country eminent in arts and arms, in wisdom and liberty." End quote. There's long been this academic and Hollywood tendency to paint the Germanic peoples as primitives, but this idea has never quite sat well with me, and ever less so the more I've learned. One of the foremost reasons is that it's difficult to imagine a primitive people so frequently besting a people considered to be vastly more advanced, often even when heavily outnumbered. It's always seemed to me that the surest measure of a nation and people's collective abilities is on the field in which it matters most, and that field that becomes most significant and necessary. This was, absolutely, the battlefield in the ancient world. Not just the realms of weapon or armor or shield making, but of strategy, tactics, organization and generalship, the structure of hierarchy and leadership, the degree of loyalty and devotion and morale felt and experienced by the average soldier. All of these things, and so much more, intertwine to create a relatively objective measure of a people's merit and ability. And by this yardstick, it's always been difficult to reconcile the modern Hollywood version of these northern peoples being brutish and unthinking. Also, of course, there's the fact that we still have the descendants of these very peoples among us today, and plucking the average Swede or Dutchman or Scotsman or Belgian off of the street, you're likely to find a relatively educated or intelligent or cultured man, relative to the worldwide norm. This idea that just a few generations ago they were all mud-caked, illiterate savages seems offensively stupid. And, to put it mildly, I'm not sure there's evidence to support it. If there is, I've not found it. Also, crucially, as Pinkerton so well puts it, quote, "We look on the Goths as enemies of science, without once reflecting that wisdom is, at any time, superior to science, and that the Goths only despise the science prevalent on the decline of Rome, which was folly, and is regarded as such by us at present." End quote. This has always been precisely my feeling, and it's a bit gratifying to see it vindicated, or at least agreed with, by thinkers like Pinkerton. All, quote, "science is not created equal. The straightforward realms of engineering or mathematics are timelessly valuable, as they make us measurably more powerful and capable, and so obviously help push us forward in a fruitful direction. Yet our modern gender or feminist studies, or intensive studies of equity or oppression, are far less so, I'd suggest, and will be winced at or looked at with bemused wonder or confusion in generations to come. The former focuses on immutable truths and laws of nature and the universe, and is the study of timeless truths that are obviously real and logical to all, whereas the latter represents something very different, and something far more superficial and ephemeral and merely political, a temporary cultural overlay masquerading as a branch of science, but in no way fitting the more pure and rightful and healthy definition of that word. This isn't to say that the science the Goths or Scythians rejected or practiced to a lesser degree was the feminist studies or racial equality notions of the Romans. It's simply to make the point that some branches of, quote, science are far more fundamental and valuable than others. And to some degree, their objective value is made obvious in how much their study directly improves the lives and abilities of those who practice them. And it might even be said that nature herself is the best of all universities, and our attempts to so remove ourselves from her stage and confine ourselves to concrete buildings surrounded by fluorescent lighting and dreary, nasal-toned professors and teachers, increasingly teaching our children why they should feel ashamed of themselves, has been a significant step backward in a very real sense. Wisdom is absolutely superior to the purely superficial intellect, just as timeless and foundational knowledge that helps orient us on the deepest levels is vastly superior to much of the science du jour of any one specific age, as the one is far less liable to opening the door to error and misjudgment than the other. And this perspective ideally extends into our understanding of history. Pinkerton tells us, quote, "The reader must also observe that though my proofs that the Germans were Scythi from Asia opens a new field, yet heaven forbid that I should make a new hypothesis in ancient history. No, the truth is always old. What shall now be shown was originally well known, though afterward lost. I do not discover new opinions, but old facts that were hid under the soil of error. When they are dug up, they will be found to evidence their antiquity by their fabric." End quote. I greatly appreciate his specific wording here and the use of that term fabric, and can't help but recognize that the best and most efficient thinkers so often seem to be those of a multidisciplinary bent, those most capable of soaring above any one singular field, but who rather put in the effort to begin to tie all of their conclusions together in something of a broader interconnected fabric, to help avoid any missteps or errors within any one of them, owing to its much more narrow context picture. This broader fabric also helps prevent this modern academic tendency, which I've come to consider borderline criminal, of simply tossing out scores of histories and works that don't agree with the broader narrative they seek to paint. Initially, I too largely trusted opinions here, and tossed out or discredited many of the works they've suggested we ignore. But over the years I couldn't help but realize how many of these works, across numerous different subjects, were saying the same things, and not, seemingly, drawing from the same sources or from the same supposed mistakes as one another in doing so, but rather from independent sources, and that scarcely a single one of them directly supported our conventional theories or modern academia. Gradually, I realized that to believe modern conventional theories, we're forced to throw out not just one or two, or even just a large handful of works and accounts and opinions, but hundreds. In many ways, nearly all of them. We're asked to believe that our ancestors were dishonest, or incredibly ignorant, or misinformed, or prideful to the degree that they'd simply invent stories out of whole cloth, and that somehow these supposedly false stories and their broader narratives would magically dovetail and align almost perfectly with one another. I can't count the number of instances in which a people referred to as Scythian by one ancient author are then referred to as Gothic, or as Germanic, or as some branch of the Germanic peoples by another author from a similar time period. And this often even occurs within the same work, with a single author using these labels completely interchangeably, as if wanting to clarify that these were one people with different names. In any other case, with this many clear references tying these groups together and speaking to them as a singular entity, I feel it'd be accepted as the most plain and obvious truth. But in this one unique case, modern academics seem absolutely devoted to making the opposite case, seemingly at all costs. Yet, even still, having read virtually every one of their major arguments that I'm aware of, I've yet to see any genuinely compelling evidence to support their speculative contention, let alone anything definitive or concrete. And it's such a weighty claim they make, and one that completely severs Western mankind from its history and achievements to the East, and leaves the Germanic peoples essentially without any history whatsoever prior to approximately 200 or 300 AD, a blank slate and a massive looming question mark. That to make such claims in disagreement with the majority of surviving historical accounts, in my opinion, demands some clear and concise evidence and arguments. In his work, Pinkerton makes three, quote, grand arguments to show the connection between Scythian and Goth, in making the case that the two were essentially one. Firstly, language. Quote, the learned and judicious Sheringham observes that there are three ways to judge the origins of nations. Number 1, from relation of speech. Number 2, from accounts preserved in ancient history. And number 3, from similar manners. But that the first is the chief and most certain arguments. This is indeed common sense, for if we found a people in Japan who spoke French, they must be of French origin, and it is one of these truths which cannot be controverted. Language is a most permanent matter, and not even total revolutions in nations can change it. A philosopher well told Augustus that it was not in his power to make one word a citizen of Rome. When a speech changes, it is in many centuries, and it only changes clothes, not body and soul. It can be proved that the language of the old Germans was Scythic, or, what has infallibly above shown to be the same, Gothic, by these following facts. The consonance of these Scythic remains with the Old German is universally known. The Frankic is a dialect of the Teutonic, Tudesque or Old German, and the Gospels of Ulfilas bear such affinity to the Frankic, of which fragments are preserved in the early French historians and elsewhere, that Delacroze and Michaelis have pronounced these Gospels to be part of an Old Frankic version, though Lai, Kneitel, and others have refuted that opinion from history and comparison of the dialects. Schilter, in his invaluable Thesaurus, has given us many large monuments of the Tudesque, or Old German, from the 7th century downward, and it is clear that the Old Scythic of Ulfilas is the same language. Wachter's learned glossary of the ancient German also certifies this point, and the skillful Ibri, after hesitating whether the Gospels of Ulfilas bear most resemblance of the German or Scandinavian dialect of the Gothic, gives it in favor of the former, adding that some words, as might be expected, are neither found in the Old German nor Scandinavian. The Anglo-Saxon, as it is called, but which should be styled the Anglo-Belgic, is also known by all to be a venerable and excellent dialect of the Tudesque, and it bears such intimate connection with the Scythic Gospels that the noble work of Lai, the Dictionarium Saxonico et Gothico Latinum, is built wholly upon their identity. The Scandinavian, of which the oldest relics are Icelandic and begin with Arius Frodi in the 11th century, is a dialect of the German. The remains we have in it are more modern by 4 centuries than those of the German, for nothing shall be built on the runic inscriptions. And those Icelandic relics are more polished, and the words more shortened, a grand mark of a polished tongue, as long words are of a rude and primitive one, not only because more modern than the German, but because the Icelandic was refined by a long succession of poets and historians, almost worthy of Greece or Rome. Hence, the Icelandic, being a more polished language than the German, has less affinity with the parent Gothic. The Swedish is nearer related to the Icelandic than either the Danish or Norwegian, the two latter countries being under one monarch of German extract, and from the proximity of Denmark to Germany, many words have crept in. But that the Swedish is the daughter of the Scythic of Ulfilas is amply known from Ear's work, the Glossary Suevo-Gothicum. And Walafrid Strabo, who wrote under Louis the Pious, Emperor of Germany, about 820, observes justly, the Goths, who were also called Getai, had our language, that is, the Tudesque. This fact Walafrid must have seen from the translation of Scripture by Ulfilas, mentioned by the ecclesiastic historians, and famous from the first over all Christendom. The modern German, a language spoken in a far greater extent than any other in Europe, and now beginning to be much studied from the number of good books in it, resembles the Gothic Gospels more than the present Danish, Norwegian, or Swedish, and has certainly more ancient stamina. Its likeness to the Asiatic tongues, in harshness and inflexible thickness of sound, is very apparent. In form, structure, and in numerous words, it agrees with the Persian, as all know. And Busiquius shows that the clowns of Crim Tartary, not Tartars but the remains of the old Scythi, speak a language almost German. On to the second argument, and that of historical sources. Pinkerton states that the ancients didn't have an exhaustive or comprehensive knowledge, but did seem to know a handful of things with certainty. Number 1, that the Celts were in the west of Europe, above Spain, or in Gaul and Britain. Number 2, that in the northwest of Europe, or in present Germany and Scandinavia, were the Scythi and the Celto-Scythi, or those Scythi in Gaul and Britain who bordered on the Celts, as the Indo-Scythi did on the Indians. Number 3, that the Sarmatai were on the north of Greece, to the east of the Scythi of Germany, all of which will clearly appear from the following authorities. Herodotus places the Celts quite to the west and the Pillars of Hercules, whereas in his geography of Scythia, he evidently supposes that the Scythians spread all over the northwest of Europe, even to the Northern Ocean, or Baltic. The Agathyrsi and Geloni he ranks among the Scythian nations, who united in the General League against Darius. Now Dionysius and Ptolemy place the Agathyrsi and Geloni upon the Baltic Sea. We learn from this that the ancient Greeks knew that the Scythi extended to the utmost northwest extremity of Europe, or up to Scandinavia. Number 2, Xenophon, who wrote about 380 years before Christ, in his Memorabilia Socratis, says, "In Europe the Scythians bear sway," showing that as the Persians were the ruling people in Asia, so were the Scythi in Europe. Had the Scythians of Europe been regarded by Xenophon as confined to ancient Scythia, he could not have given them this description, but he palpably understood that they extended into the heart and furthest parts of Europe, and bore universal sway in it. Number 3, Aristotle says the Ister, or Danube, flowed from the Pyrenees, mountains of Celtica, and he speaks of the cold of Scythia, and adds that the country of the Celts, above Spain, is also cold. He, as well as Herodotus, knew that the Celts were confined to Celtic Gaul and to Britain, for he calls the tin that was brought from Britain Celtic tin. Quote, "They say that Celtic tin melts much sooner than lead." Number 4, in the next century, or about 250 years before Christ, Pythias, Xenophon, and others, authors quoted by Pliny in his Natural History, speak of the Prussian coast in which amber is found, saying it lay opposite to Scythia, distant a day or two's sail. Pliny quotes them separately, and they vary in some points, but all agree in this, which shows to a certainty that the Greeks knew the Scythians to extend to Scandinavia and over all the north of Germany. Procopius, too, seemed to clearly recognize the overlap. Quote, "To him who passes straight the lake Maeotis and its mouth, on the shore anciently dwelled the Goths, called Tectraxidae, as I just mentioned. And at a great distance were placed the Goths and Visigoths and Vandals and all other Gothic nations, who were also called Scythians in ancient times, since all the nations in these parts were in common called Scythic." End quote. And finally, on to the third grand argument. The Germans were Scythi from similar manners. Pinkerton tells us Herodotus, in his 4th book, chapter 59 to 82, gives us a long account of the manners of the Scythi, and a peculiar happiness seems to have attended this favored nation, as Tacitus has described those of their descendants, the Germans, so that the clearest splendor is thrown on the subject. To run a parallel would swell this essay to a vast size, and they are so like that they need only be referred to. Wormius, Bartholin, and other northern antiquaries have remarked that the description given of the Scythi by Herodotus applies perfectly to the Goths of their country, even down to a late age. The chief difference arises merely from a local circumstance, It is that the ancient Scythai of the Euxine, described by Herodotus, had found their fine breed of Persian horses thrive equally well in their fertile possessions on the temperate shores of the Euxine, while in Germany and Scandinavia, the cold was then too severe for that southern race, and the indigenous breed was, as Tacitus states, very small. Hence, the ancient Scythai were chiefly cavalry, while the Germans and Scandinavians had little or no cavalry. This difference was a necessary effect of climate, and infers no distinction in the people, any more than the different life led by the British in the East Indies from what they use here destroys the identity of that people. In Iceland, the Norwegians differed prodigiously in manners from those in Normandy, Calabria, or Sicily, but to instance a few particulars of similar manners in the Scythai and Germans. Firstly, domestic life. Both Scythai and Germans lived by hunting, pasturage, and rapine. Both had a few agricultural nations, but the tilled ground, as the pastoral, belonged to the community or tribe, and they quitted it at the year's end to move to another. Herodotus observes that these Scythai, who were agricultors, did not use the corn for bread, but parched it over the fire. That is, as Pellotier well explains, in order to use it in broth and for ale. And so Tacitus says of the Germans. They drank out of horns, so the Germans, or out of the skulls of their enemies, so the Germans. Ale and mead were the drink of the Thracian Scythians, and those of Scandinavia. Both drank healths and drank before entering on business. Both nations burned their illustrious dead and buried their ashes in urns under hillocks or tumuli. Pinkerton goes on to speak to similar clothing styles, with the chiefs wearing a particular close tunic and breeches. He speaks of similar tattooing and body paint used by the Celts and Picts and Scythians. He then speaks of similarities in religions, the threefold separation so common throughout all Indo-European peoples that helped inspire the ideas of caste, with Jupiter holding the scepter and responsible for rulership and governance, Mars or Ares, the sword, and Mercury, a purse. He speaks to their very deeply rooted tradition of ancestor veneration and suggests the countless parallels with the Greek is explained by the Greek, quote, gods, being these very same venerated ancestors, and great and noble men of distant ages. He points to the idea that Odin, or Woden, was said to have led men from Asia into Europe, and that, to his own day, the Anglo-Saxon royal houses all traced their lineage back to him. The theme of Jupiter, or Zeus Pitar, or an Allfather, being, quote, married to an Earth Mother, exists almost universally, and happens to dovetail perfectly with the Ralda and Freya of the Oralinda book, among so many other similar traditions. I believe his proofs here are convincing, especially in light of the larger context picture. Consider the case of America. Though receiving a massive influx of peoples from nations like Britain and Germany, it took just a few generations to establish a new culture and identity and sense of self. Of course, any educated person recognizes this to be an outgrowth of a deeper well and something larger. But that something larger frequently gets lost in the shuffle and forgotten over time. I strongly believe this is what's occurred countless times throughout history. Ask any modern descendant of the vast Germanic people family where they think their most direct ancestors were prior to approximately the birth of Christ, and most either won't have a clue or would reflexively suggest that they inhabited the same patches of ground they live on today. But this simply isn't the case for the most part. The colonies existing in Europe prior to around 500 BC were relatively small, and are dwarfed by the number of our ancestors that came in from the east in later years, with the Alans and Vandals, and a multitude of other similar Gothic peoples. There's a reason the term Scythian and Goth became catch-all terms for Greek and Roman and other peoples referencing those to the north. It's because these were massive populations stretching across vast territories. This wasn't one small tribe amongst a multitude, but rather these were the multitudes of interconnected and interrelated tribes, known under singular umbrella titles. And, I'd suggest, it was also the seat of their royal, monarchical, ruling families and lineages, who, histories clearly seem to suggest, could marshal this collection of numerous Germanic branches to fight for singular ends at times, such as the Scythians beating back the Persian Empire, or the Goths overrunning Rome. The Scots, in their Declaration of Arbroath, speak to their Scythian heritage. The Irish speak of the Scythian Milites as their founding stock. Both the Germans and Brits are often referred to as Scythian in ancient texts, with Germany even being literally called Scythia in multiple instances. Add to this the fact that virtually every Western people claimed descent from Homer's Troy, and how could one possibly assume that we've been an isolated people, incapable of travel and migration? And again, this is a relatively modern notion. To give some idea of how the Scythians were viewed by some scholars and historians prior to the institutional capture of our age, historian Baron D. Hankerville, writing in the late 1700s, spoke of the Scythians, quote, as the lords of the world's great culture, both the origin of all religious culture and a military and administrative colossus, whose rulers were simultaneously its priests. Scyths are said to have ruled over ancestors of the Indian subcontinent and Scotland, of Greek and Japanese tribes, their imperial mastery over vast expanses of land between Europe and the Himalayas, predating the deluge, and lasting some 1,500 years. End quote. And this may sound fairly wild to the modern ear, but this was hardly a unique notion among the most educated historians and scholars of these eras. And we find this figure of 1,500 years in another source, the Latin historian Justin, speaking to the history of the Goth and Scythian, and saying, quote, Asia was tributary to them for 1,500 years. So long a period is this, that many moderns have attempted to explain it away as mistake or error. And it may be, but this is an accusation that would carry more weight if the number had initially been written out in numerical form, as opposed to being fully written out in word form, making a simple typographical error, for example, seem much less likely. Moreover, we find a similar history presented in Jordanus's Getica, and, in my own personal opinion, the idea itself no way contradicts the totality of historical context. Far from it, it seems to fit in well and help explain a great deal. Everywhere, there seems to be evidence of a sprawling, loose-knit, feudalistic empire of sorts that, across stretches of time, tied together countless related peoples, from Europe to Asia to Egypt and the Levant, orchestrated and governed in a wholly non-tyrannical way by a warrior aristocracy that asked only for periodic tributes. Pinkerton states, quote, the great Hermanric, king of the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Gatai, and chief of the race of the Amali, extended his conquests so far and wide that Jordanus compares him to Alexander. End quote. And in a remark I've always found interesting, and one I wish the original authors had elaborated on more fully, Jordanus goes on to speak of the subduing of peoples who, quote, though offshoots from one stock, have now 3 names, that is, Venethi, Antis, and Sclavini. Though they now rage in war far and wide, in punishment for our sins, yet at that time they were all obedient to Hermanric's commands. There are several comments like this, from Theodoric and existing in the Getica, indicating the Goths once had a much broader reach, and blaming themselves and their own, quote, sins or weaknesses for gradually losing this reach. Due to our near total lack of surviving histories written from Gothic or Scythian perspectives, we're forced to piece together their ruling or governmental style, but it certainly resembled feudalism, broadly. Mr. Pinkerton devotes an entire section to the differences between what he believes to be the ancient feudalistic system and structure of our people, contrasted with the more modern and what he believes to be incrementally corrupted form, and tells us, quote, indeed, the feudal system, about which so much noise is made, is the natural fruit of conquest, and is as old in the world as conquest. A territory is acquired, and the state, or the general, bestows it on the leaders and soldiers on condition of military service, and of tokens, acknowledging gratitude to the donors. It was known in the Greek heroic ages. It was known to Lycurgus, for all the lands of Sparta were held on military tenure. It was known to Romulus when he regulated Rome. It was known to Augustus when he gave lands to his veterans, on condition that their sons should, at 15 years of age, do military service. The reason it did not preponderate and corrupt in Greece and Rome was that it was stifled by the necessary effects of cities, as above mentioned. In Persia, where there are no cities of any power or privilege, it preponderated and corrupted at an early period." End quote. He makes a point that I wish I could elaborate much further on, but I'd like to keep this video relatively concise, speaking to the idea that the very earliest and most ancient governmental structures amongst homogeneous Scythian or Gothic or Aryan tended, though hierarchical and aristocratic, to lean more toward the democratic end of the spectrum. Quote, "For northern nations have always been fond of liberty, while the southern preferred the delights and ease of their climate." End quote. Which makes some sense, as democracy can only function properly in a relatively homogeneous environment or culture that highly prizes virtue, honor, loyalty, and in which every man is fully expected to be capable and knowledgeable, and respected enough to have his personal opinion valued. Only as conditions began to degenerate did a heavier hand and slightly more restrictive rule become almost a necessity. But freedom from any unjust tyranny was always a bedrock principle of these peoples. These were men who had strong leaders because they chose to, because they respected them enough to grant them their energy to help accomplish still greater things, not because they were forcibly compelled to do so. In our age of multiculturalism, of exceedingly weak and dependent men becoming mere cogs within economic machines, an age of effortless mass manipulation by malevolent actors, democracy is an absolute disaster, inevitably. It gradually becomes the rule of money and media. But the conception itself wasn't always such a net negative. Athens is often spoken of as the, quote, birthplace of democracy. So this leads us nicely into a discussion of the powerful connection between the most ancient Greece and Scythia. Again and again, we find evidence of the Scythian and Goth being a seed or feeder people, whose ancient expatriates seemed to travel and settle far and wide. India, Persia, the Levant, and Greece. And let's not forget or discount, in the one surviving Gothic history we do have, they clearly mention pushing all the way to the borders of Egypt, into Media and Persia and beyond. Should we pretend these stray lines are just outright lies? And if so, for what purpose? And with regard to Greece, I've mentioned in the past that ancient histories speak of the Pelasgi as being the earliest recorded population. But it's always been a bit of a mystery as to who exactly these Pelasgi were, and where they came from. Pinkerton clearly believes their heritage to be Scythian, and states, quote, "The Pelasgi, or Hellenes or Greeks, were Scythians of Thrace." This plain sense might argue at once, because the Greeks were everywhere surrounded by Scythia and the sea, and no other nation was near them. This may be shown from different arguments, though the Greek writers have shaded the subject much by the foolish desire of making their nation aboriginal, or sprung from the ground on which they lived. It is a pity they saw not so far as the philosopher Antisthenes, who used to tell the Athenians that such praise belonged to snails and not to men. But that the Pelasgi were Scythii appears from this, that they certainly descended from the northeast into Greece, and the Scythii spread over all these parts. For we find settlements of the Pelasgi on the Hellespont, and in Thessaly, a country to the northeast of Greece, a large country that was specifically called Pelasgia in the days of Homer, and far later. Trogus Pompeius says expressly that the people of Macedon were anciently called Pelasgi. Strabo says that the Thracians under Eumolpus colonized Attica, and Herodotus calls these Thracians Pelasgi, as above shown. Plutarch says, the Pelasgi, as they say, roving over the greatest part of the world, and having subdued the inhabitants, reside in the country which they had conquered. This can only refer to the Scythi. Pausanias shows the oracle at Delphi to have been founded by the Scythi Hyperboreae, and the ancient grammarian Simmias of Rhodes in the 3rd century BC connected the Hyperboreans directly to the Massagetae. End quote. Elsewhere, Pinkerton goes on, quote, the Greeks, fermented into a purity by foreign colonies, soon assumed quite a distinct character from their Scythian progenitors and neighbors. Homer also rose from the eastern shore of the Aegean like the sun upon them, and diffused an intellectual light and warmth which made their souls vegetate with great thoughts, the stems of great actions. So early as about 1,000 years before Christ, Grecian colonies began to be established in Magna Graecia, or the south of Italy, in Sicily, in Africa, nay, in Macedon and Thrace, and among the more distant Scythi, in which later countries, for want of tillage and the arts, barbarism was long to prevail. While, owing to fortunate circumstances above mentioned, the Greeks had admitted such refinement as almost to pass for another people among their own progenitors, a case which may even happen in ruder nations, as we know that the Danes, who came to Northumberland in the 9th century, were regarded as utter strangers and enemies by their own countrymen, the Angli, who in 547 had settled that province. End quote. And once more, by Pinkerton, quote, the Hellenes were Scythi. Even mythology might persuade this, for it is well known that Hellen, reputed father of the Hellenic name, was the son of Deucalion, and Lucian says expressly that Deucalion was a Scythian. Quote, Deucalion the Scythian, in whose time happened the Great Flood. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus. Prometheus was the king of the Scythi. The Locrians, said to be the first to be called Hellenes, closely related to their neighbors the Dorians and Phocians, are said to have arrived in southern Greece in the late 2nd millennium BC from their homeland on Pindus, when the Greek tribes moved southwards. And it might be shown that the Greek mythology is but an improvement of the Scythic, the gods being most illustrious princes of the first Scythic Empire, who were deified by their subjects, a custom continued to a late period among the Goths. Many ideas of Greek mythology may also be found in the Gothic, but this ground must not be lightly trodden, and is left to him who can employ a large work upon it. It is well known that the most ancient Greek poets were the sole teachers of the people, and were the first who, by introducing a portion of allegory and an elegant method into vulgar tradition and superstition, composed regular systems of theogony and mythology. Now, these earlier poets and teachers of religion were all of Thrace. Linus, Orpheus, Musaeus, Thamyris, Eumolpus were all Thracians, and Eustathius has long ago observed this singularity. If Thracians, they were Scythians or Goths. If Scythians, they could only use Scythic mythology and traditions. Plato, in Cratyllo, says, the Greek rites are all from the barbarians, that is, as just shown, the barbarians of Thrace. Thucydides is an incontrovertible authority that the Hellenes were originally a small tribe in Thessaly, and Herodotus and Strabo fully confirm this, and that the Thessalians were Thracians is clear, for Thucydides informs us that the Thracians extended even down to Phocia. Strabo calls the Athenians Thracians, whom Herodotus calls the Pelasgi of Thessaly, which was the country between Thrace and Attica. Eusebius and the Chronicon Pascal mark the Ionians as Scythi. Epiphanius says that all the people south of the Hellespont were Scythi, that is, the Macedonians and Greeks. Thucydides well observes that in Homer's time the name of barbarians was not given to the Thracians, but that these barbarians and the Hellenes spoke one tongue. Diodorus Siculus says the Scythi Hyperboreal, or most distant Scythi, used a speech akin to that of Athens or Delos. that is, as the scholar Ayer well explains, Pelasgic or Scythic. Anacharsis, the Scythian philosopher, pronounced the Greeks Scythic, as he must have learned from their language and manners. Blackwell, in his admirable Inquiry into the Life and Writings of Homer, has well concluded the language of Thrace and Greece to have been the same, and especially quotes Strabo, who was of Colchis, and who says that the Trojan language had many words and names in common with the Thracian. And this I found especially fascinating. According to Stephanus of Byzantium, long before the ancient Greeks started referring to the region as Thrace, it was known as Arya. Ancient Greek mythology provides the Thracians with a mystical ancestor Thrax, the son of the war god Ares, who was said to reside in Thrace. Josephus wrote that Tyras became ancestor of the Thracians, a, quote, flame-haired people, according to Xenophanes. Herodotus calls the Gatai the noblest as well as the most just of all the Thracian tribes. According to Pausanias, the land of the Hyperboreans, men living beyond the home of Boreas. Homer placed Boreas in Thrace, and therefore Hyperborea was, in his opinion, north of Thrace. It's also worth noting that Pinkerton even claims, quote, those childishly called Druidic are all Gothic, and are found in Iceland and other countries where the very name of Druid was unknown, end quote, indicating that the famed priestly or bardic class of the Goths, known to play the cithara and sing the praises of their ancestors before major battles, may lie at the root of what became this widespread Druidic element. It's also worth noting that Jordanus clearly states that Telephus is an ancestor of the Goths. Quote, he matched his father's valor by virtues of his own, and also recalled the traits of Hercules by his likeness and appearance. Our ancestors called his kingdom Moesia, end quote. Targataios, or Scythes, thought to be the Heracles of Greek legend, was the ancestral, quote, god of the Scythians, according to Scythian mythology. A frequent framing of ancient Greece is that of a softer, seafaring, earlier settling, and perhaps often city-dwelling element of Ionians, with closer connection to the, quote, Pelasgi, and the ruder and rougher Dorians, sweeping in via a wave from the northwest. Though in actuality these two peoples were almost certainly the closest possible genetic kin, and merely represent two waves, separated by several generations, from the same seed people, representing a model we see play out time and time and time again. Pinkerton, again, quote, for as shall afterwards be shown, the Greeks themselves were Goths, being originally Pelasgi, a Scythic or Gothic colony, and the Romans also were of the same stem. And though we, misled by a puerile love of the Romans, revile the ruder Goths, our fathers, as despisers of learning and the arts, because they scorned the sophistical reading and fantastic arts prevalent on the decline of the Roman Empire, which we at present scorn. Yet, as shown in the preface, the Goths were the friends of every elegant art and useful science. And, when not constrained to arms alone by the inevitable situation and spirit of their society, they carried every art and science to heights unknown before, as the ancient Greeks and modern Europeans might witness, in wisdom, that perfection of human nature. And Pinkerton elsewhere. But their learning even in unsocial wilds and circumstances of society which precluded attention to elegance, while necessity was the law, is a curious subject and shall be briefly touched. Herodotus says the Scythians were both learned and wise. Zalmoxis, the early lawgiver of the Goths, is well known, and so is Dicenius. Anacharsis was the next Scythic philosopher. He was of the royal family, his brother, Cadrada, and nephew Endartharphus, being kings of the Gatai, or parental Goths, peculiarly so called. He lived with Solon, 590 years before Christ. Menander, the celebrated founder of the New Comedy, whose drama was called the School of Wisdom, was a Goth of Gestia, as Strabo, in Book 6, tells us from his works, and gives us the lines, apparently from one of his prologues, quote, for all the Thracians, but the Getae chiefly, from whom I glory to derive my birth, have never yet been cold to female beauty, end quote. In my own efforts to avoid bias and help ensure even-handedness, finding myself heaping praise on the martial exploits of the Goths, contrasted with their Eastern Roman opponents, I spoke highly of Belisarius as the most exceptional Eastern Roman general, though it seems I failed, as Pinkerton reveals that apparently Belisarius too was ethnically a Goth from Thrace. And we focus on Greece in particular here for a moment, because they're certainly one of the most important elements of context. But we could engage in a similar tracing of connections with ancient Persia, or India, or the Levant, or even the Far East. This phenomenon we see happen to Greece seems to happen to Ireland, and I suspect that this is what occurred with nearly every region in the Western world. It's just that in these cases we have the direct surviving accounts. In other words, large waves of incoming peoples, seemingly of the same racial stock, yet of slightly different cultural strains, because representing branches separated by hundreds of years, enter from abroad. The Heraclidae and Dorians seem to be a great example of this in Greece, as are the Firbolg and Tuatha De Danann in Ireland. Pinkerton claims the Germanic Gauls, the Belgae to be specific, were these very Firbolg populations, so frequently mentioned in Irish histories. Pinkerton says, quote, "It shall be shown that the Belgae were the ruling people in Ireland, and that the Irish, or Old Scottish royal stem, is really Belgic or Gothic. These Belgae are the Firbolg of the Irish annals, with whom their real history begins. And such was their superiority that, to this day, Bolg in Irish implies a nobleman, and also a man of science." End quote. It also bears mentioning that the royal clans behind numerous Scandinavian kings were the Skildings and Skilfings, respectively. In the History of the Norwegian People, by Knut Gertset, quote, "The Swedes were closely related to the Goths, among whom kingship had reached a much higher development than in Western Germany, where the kings were still mere tribal chieftains and leaders of the armed host. Among the Goths, the king was the ruler of his people, a national sovereign, who traced his lineage to the gods themselves. This institution of national kingship also obtained among the Swedes, and it is probable that they had adopted it from their Gothic kinsmen." Wikipedia tells us, quote, "The Scythians were monarchical, and the king of all the Scythians was the main tribal chief, who was from the dominant tribe of the royal Scythians. Power among the Scythian kings was passed down a single dynasty, and the historian and anthropologist Anatoly Kazanov has suggested that the Scythians had been ruled by the same dynasty from the time of their stay in West Asia until the end of their kingdom in the Pontic steppe." In summary, I believe Beckwith's work, The Scythian Empire, was correct in its conclusions, and groundbreaking in being one of the first to bring so many of the pieces of the puzzle together. Atop this theory, I strongly believe Pinkerton to be correct when he speaks to the extraordinarily strong connections between Scythian and Goth. The ramifications of both of these theories being true, even approximately, could hardly be more important and weighty, and really would rewrite the history books, specifically and especially those that have taken such a hard left turn after the World War. But even those authored previously, because never before have we had such a vast and impressive data picture accessible to provide broader context. Whether or not there's a great deal of conscious or conspiratorial motive to sever the history of Western mankind from its connections to the East and to the broader world, I can't say for certain. What I believe I can say for certain is that the evidence for this strong connection is simply overwhelming, and that, in my opinion, no objective or dispassionate reading of this multitude of older sources could lead any rational mind to discount it. No, I don't buy this modern theory that the Romans, the Greeks, and even the Goths and Scythians themselves were merely confused when they grouped so many people under a single umbrella label like Scythian. Scythian, before it became so incredibly minimized and confused in modern times, once represented essentially an ethnic term and an ethnic group with extremely ancient and deep roots. It's important to remember Pompeius Trogus' history speaks of debates between Egyptians and Scythians as to which of these peoples was the oldest, with the Scythians supposedly winning this argument. And there's even a fascinating battle recounted by at minimum 4 of our most significant ancient historians between the Scythians and Egyptians. Herodotus and Diodorus pull exclusively from the Egyptian accounts, while admitting that even among themselves these accounts are strangely contradictory and inconsistent, accounts which credit Egypt as the victor. But others give the victory to the Scythians. Fascinatingly, Jordanus's Getica mentions this same conflict, and yet quite literally speaks of the Goths as the Scythian element in this conflict, and states that under their ancient Gothic king Tanausis, who was dated by Alfred von Gutschmidt to have ruled from about 1323 BC to 1290 BC, while other estimates range anywhere from 1300 to 1900 BC, quote, inflicted a severe defeat upon him, pursuing him even to Egypt, mentioning that had he not been restrained by the Nile, he would have killed Sesostris in his own land. It also mentions that several of the Goths or Scythians left this victorious army to take up positions of power in the conquered lands, and that this is where the Parthians originated. We are asked to completely dismiss this by modern academia, just like we're asked to dismiss so many similar accounts. But why? It makes no sense to me. And I feel like the Goth and Scythian is uniquely targeted by modern academia when it comes to this type of dismissal of historical accounts. I'd suggest the majority of the ancestors of modern Europeans didn't exclusively exist for thousands of years in small pockets in Western Europe and Scandinavia, milling about in forests, painting themselves and one another, isolated and unmoving, accomplishing and achieving nothing of note. Though they certainly knew this territory well, and no doubt had colonies or scattered settlements here, this was absolutely not their exclusive home, especially prior to approximately 400 to 500 BC. It gradually became their exclusive home, their final and most significant region of settlement, due to cascading waves of peoples gradually pushing the bulk of them ever westward, and then, due to the daunting Atlantic Ocean acting as temporary barrier to all that lay beyond, halting and creating truly great and unprecedented nations and empires, until their eventual expansion into the Americas and that sea of wagon trains extending westward in countless directions, so directly evocative of a scene we encounter again and again throughout the Gothic and Scythian past, and among what I believe to be highly related peoples like the Dorians and the even more ancient Heraclidae. As consequence, I believe the Europeans of the Middle Ages, and up to just a handful of decades ago, were completely correct to feel themselves strongly connected to ancient Greece, to Anatolia and Troy, to ancient Persia and India. Even the very idea that our most powerful and lasting stories might involve people groups they had no ancestral connection to strikes me as unbelievably absurd. I'd suggest they so celebrated and resonated with these stories because they had a much firmer handle on their connection to them and the leading personalities involved in them, dormant residual memories of their direct connections to a distant age, distant ancestors. I hope you'll pardon my editorializing for a minute, but we've now lost so much of this in modernity, and this entire sphere of history is being paved over and quite literally rewritten. And this link, which was on the verge of being fully uncovered, revealed, fleshed out by scholars and historians of prior ages, is now being severed in conventional academic spheres. And if I had to guess, I'd bet this isn't fully organic or coincidence. This all seems to be part and parcel of a larger agenda. The people I speak to in these videos, this unique family of peoples I so love and admire and respect and resonate with, is now rapidly disappearing. These nations and cultures, so beautifully cultivated across generations of mankind, are being destroyed and replaced, with many simply convinced this is the natural and organic path of, quote, progress, convinced that this is just the effects of the forward march of time, that our destiny is to serve the almighty dollar, the international marketplace, international finance. But we must remember, now more importantly than ever before, that we're not merely passive observers in this process. And to diminish ourselves to that submissive role is to risk losing everything. If something is good and worthwhile, if something is exceptional and beautiful, or feels especially healthy and comfortable and resonant, that something is worth fighting to preserve. More than this, I believe it's our duty to both preserve and further cultivate such things. White privilege is, of course, a silly, loaded, politicized, and manipulative term, so frequently used dishonestly and as a bludgeon. But let's face facts for a moment. We absolutely did inherit a powerfully beautiful gift from those incredibly capable individuals who came before us. It feels as if we stand at a crossroads, and on the brink of not just losing this inheritance, but allowing ourselves to be convinced by dishonest and malevolent actors that it's not even worthy of preserving, or that the very idea of preserving it is somehow evil. These are insidious and destructive lies, and need to start being called out and recognized as such. It's said that, quote, "A man of integrity passes his father's civilization to his son without selling it off to strangers." There's still time to recognize, remember, and act accordingly. If current trends continue, not only will our father's civilization and cultures disappear, but even the stories and legends and accounts that tell these tales disappear. None of us should be willing to pay this price. You and I are not some atomized and isolated random collection of matter and cells. We are the all-important center point of an hourglass, a link in a long and storied chain, stretching back God knows where, containing the same blood, the same genetic material as those truly great men who strode ahead before us. Please beware of letting the cheapening effects of modernity extend to your soul and your very being. We were meant for so much more than this. And while we still live and breathe, each and every last one of us is blessed with the opportunity to prove it.